gentlemen, welcome to Web Summit. Fantastic to see you on the ground here.
Thank you.
I want to start with the big topic that we're talking about, rebuilding trust. And this may not be the question you're expecting. Is it time to be talking about rebuilding trust when we've not been through this cleansing process yet? We've got a whole heap of investigations where we're waiting for outcomes. We keep hearing about the misdemeanors of big tech. The cleansing process needs to finish first, doesn't it? Brad?
Well, I guess I would say it's never too early and it's seldom too late to focus on what you need to do to earn people's trust. You know, it's obviously the kind of thing that needs to be done every day. That's almost a cliche. But I think the worst thing we could do is say, oh, well, let's just wait. We won't do what it takes to address these issues today. I think we need to do even more every day.
DOJ, FTC, state attorneys general still compiling evidence. What do you think? Is it too early to talk about rebuilding trust?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think first, most people in America still believe in the promise of technology. Technology to improve healthcare outcomes, technology to improve communication, technology to improve the dissemination of information. But what they want to make sure is it's properly regulated, that it's not abused. And the pace of technological change has been so fast. Frankly, I put most of the blame on the doorsteps of Congress. We have not done our job in having a thoughtful regulatory framework, and we need to step up and do that.
Brad, you mentioned before a series of red flags that have gone up around pivotal moments, the likes of the Snowden revelations, the former NSA contractor, also the Cambridge Analytica scandal. You've been on the front line battling antitrust too for Microsoft over the years as a lawyer. How serious do you think the investigations that are happening around big tech are at this point? Will they prove to be instrumental and pivotal moment in history?
Well, I think that the investigations that are underway now will be important. I think it's always important to think about them on a global level. That's one of the many things that we learned at Microsoft from the 1990s. And you have big cases in Brussels with the European Commission. You have in Washington, D.C., the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission. You have a pretty unusual situation to see more than 40 states and their attorneys general working together on these things. I do think at the end of the day, competition law and antitrust cases move slowly. And I do think it's right to look to the Congress. It's right to look in Europe to the European Parliament, the European Commission. Ultimately, I think the fundamental question, really the most fundamental question, is what is the problem that people want to solve? Once you understand the problem and have some agreement on it, you can decide, is it an antitrust case? Is it a new law in a place like Congress? Is it some other form of regulation? And I think that is what sort of worries me a little bit. We probably need that. As you say, maybe the cleansing in part is, what is the problem we're trying to solve here?
Yeah, Rod, come in on this because it's an interesting question to put to both of you, because you've both been talking about new laws and how to introduce new legislation to try and even the playing field and tackle some of the issues in big tech. Yet the cleansing, these investigations, they could be quite instrumental in forming new legislation. So what do you think the value is in these investigations that are taking place?
Well, I'd say two things. On the specific investigations, I actually think the Microsoft case is a pretty good outcome. I mean, the case went all the way to the D.C. Circuit, where the D.C. Circuit said, should we break Microsoft up? And the D.C. Circuit said no. But what they said is that Microsoft shouldn't be allowed to tie Internet Explorer with Netscape. And that allowed for competitive companies like Google and others to emerge. So, and I don't think anyone now would say Microsoft should have been broken up. So I think you can look at thoughtful past case law to see how we can prevent anti-competitive platform privileges, which to me is the big issue. But the broader issue, I think when you talk to most Americans, their concern is not specific to antitrust or even privacy. Their concern is, how do we participate in the technology economy? The world is changing. Technology is changing. Our kids are being left out. How do we have a stake in it? And then manifests itself in a concern about bigness and tech. But the real thing they're asking, in my view, is where do we fit in? And that's a much broader and more difficult conversation, and that's what we need to address as Congress, as tech companies, is expanding opportunity to people and communities left out.
You want to respond, Brad?
Well, I think that I basically agree. I think what this really shows is frankly, it's not a single problem that we're trying to solve, but several. And we do need to get clarity around them. I do think that when we're talking about trust, I think people sort of want to know, are we creating a future we can control? We, the people and the public, can control. Will we be able to control our security? Will we be able to control our privacy? As we empower machines with artificial intelligence and the ability to make decisions, will we even be able to control these machines? I think that is one side of this equation, and I think that we do need laws and responsible industry steps to do that. But I also think there's this other question, and Roe really addresses it well. I think people are asking, are we going to have jobs in this future? Are our kids going to have jobs in this future? And that's a question not just in, say, the Appalachians, but in the west of Ireland, in the east of Poland, really across Europe as well. And I think that today we see technology moving some people forward. It's making some companies very large and wealthy, and it's leaving rural communities in its wake. Communities that don't have access to broadband, that don't have access to the digital skills that will be important. And so I think we need to sort of address each of these issues, and they're each going to need their own solutions.
I know a couple of years back, there was a conversation I had about broadening out the story of big technology away from Silicon Valley. I was like, really? Is that actually going to happen? And here we are. We've seen ecosystems pop up everywhere, even across European cities. But creating jobs is one thing in addressing the trust factor. The other point, and in your commentary, and I don't know whether you meant to go there, it's about sharing the wealth from data collection. Is there a dividend that is paid for customers for accessing all that data? And that very fundamental change would shift the product or profitability model away from some of these big technology companies. I mean, Facebook, a great example of that. Is that what you're talking about, sharing that profitability factor, or is it just about job creation?
I think it's both. I mean, I do think we need an Internet Bill of Rights and America to engage in the conversation on privacy and antitrust. We shouldn't just defer to, frankly, to Europe in the GDPR. And right now, Europe is defining the privacy and antitrust framework for 80% of the world because the United States hasn't engaged in having a federal privacy law. We haven't engaged in updating our antitrust laws to adapt to the technology economy. And I think in that privacy law should be the right to have ownership of your data or consent if the data is collected or transferred. But I don't think this is going to be a panacea to the economic question. Even if you compensated every person for the data that Facebook or Google or Microsoft uses, maybe you're talking about $1,000 a year. They should have some compensation. But the idea that we're going to be able to provide a middle-class life just by compensating people for data, I don't think is correct. What we should do is have that right, but also look at other job creation opportunities.
I think one way to think about this is as follows. If you look back at the 20th century, the invention that changed the world was the combustion engine. That's what led to cars, trucks, planes. And oil was what fueled the combustion engine. AI is going to be, I think, the fundamental invention that changes the economy over the next 3 decades. Data is what fuels AI. Data has rapidly become, arguably the most valuable asset on the planet. Certainly one way to look at it is whether individuals are getting a fair economic exchange for their data. And I think that is one reason that some of these antitrust cases are really scrutinizing behavioral advertising in particular, because it has an incentive, if you will, to keep monetizing data, arguably in ways that not only impact the economics, but even the way democracy is functioning. But I also think there's a broader dimension. I would argue that even more important than the impact on individuals is what it means in a place like Europe for every sector of the economy. As automobiles become autonomous vehicles, who's going to reap the economic value of the data that is driving these cars? Will it be the automakers in Europe, or will it be a small number of companies in his district in Silicon Valley on the west coast of the United States and a small number of companies on the east coast of China? I think the answer should be no. And we're only going to make that answer no is if we really do, I think, for data, what open source did for code. We need an open data movement, and we need public policy that is going to facilitate it, including public policy in Europe.
You raise a lot of points. There's many different angles I want to tackle that from. But I want to talk about big tech. I mean, Andrew, you've mentioned on a number of news channels, including CNBC, that you don't necessarily want big tech broken up. And I just want to push back against that a little bit, because what you've got is big tech at the moment trying to make even more acquisitions using very large cash reserves, trying to make further purchases, and Google going after Fitbit is another great example into another sector, Facebook trying to grow into cryptocurrency. So we're talking about some of it organic growth, some of it through acquisitions, not even talking about splitting up these companies, we're talking about stopping them. Do you think there should be measures to stop the growth of big tech?
I do think there needs to be far more scrutiny on mergers, and particularly mergers and acquisitions that are horizontal or potentially anti-competitive. There should have been more scrutiny when Facebook acquired Instagram and WhatsApp. Now, it's hard to argue in a counterfactual, right? Because they make a number of acquisitions that don't turn out to be Instagram. But there needs to be, and Jason Furman has a paper on that, looking not just at what the acquisition is at the time, but the potential of what that acquisition could be, and that scrutiny has to take place in mergers, and there is a healthy role for doing that. But I would argue that's not just in tech. I mean, when you're having AT&T be allowed to have Time Warner acquired, you know, we've got a problem of consolidation across the economy and need to address that. I will, though, disagree with European law in that I do think that the standard still should be, by and large, consumer welfare. Now, we should look at wages, we should look at jobs, we should look at communities, but I don't think I think the standard shouldn't just be protecting a business.
You know, and I think you're astute to make the point you made. Long before governments ever break up companies, which frankly they seldom do if you look at the history of antitrust law, they basically say, well, we're not prepared to make you smaller, but we're going to make it harder for you to become bigger. And you know, that happened to Microsoft. Before there was an antitrust case to break the company up, there was an antitrust case that stopped Microsoft from acquiring a banking software application, Quicken. And so, you know, we're sort of seeing history, you know, repeat itself to some degree. And I think that, you know, everybody who works in the business community has to expect, really, as you said, Ro, you know, there's going to be more antitrust scrutiny of mergers and acquisitions, and you better make sure that you have a strong case to make in terms of what it will do for competition and consumer welfare, if in fact you want to go forward with something that's big.
I want to bring up the trade war, which has morphed into a tech war, because as we talk about trust, the focus from the White House on the operations of Chinese technology companies has raised a question of trust around Chinese operators, and I wonder whether we will bridge a gap now and repair some of that trust. Also, Brad, as you mentioned, open source and open systems, autonomous cars theoretically need to work on very open systems, so you can still have a smartphone as the central device, connect up to all the various apps, and have a system that works across the board. Do you have concerns now that we have barriers going up, that trust is stopping the innovation of the future in autonomous and other areas we don't even know about at this point?
In regard to China, here's what I would say. I mean, obviously, we have to be cautious about our values of freedom of expression, non-censorship, defining the future of the internet. But I think the missed opportunity with the administration is that they're not dealing with the Chinese competition the way we dealt with Sputnik. Post-Sputnik, the United States put 3% of our GDP in investment in science and technology. What we should be most focused on is why is China winning potentially in investments in AI, investments in nanotechnology, investments in quantum computing. The United States should be making those investments, working with the private sector and universities to do what we did to win the Cold War.
On that point, citizens have trust in China, in their governments, and are happy to hand over the data. Slightly different situation now.
Well, I don't know if they have trust. They're compelled to do it. I think most Chinese would probably rather live in a free enterprise democracy than under a communist regime. I mean, that's my own view. But I think the American system is much better than the Chinese system. I mean, we have a free enterprise pluralistic democracy, and we shouldn't be afraid to say that that is a much better system of governance.
Brad, what would you say about the trade war and the impact it's having on technology and being able to do what it does, innovate?
Well, I think that it's we're best served to take issues of trade and issues of trust and really talk about them and deal with them as distinct issues. I worry that when we conflate them, we create confusion. We potentially sow seeds of doubt in our allies, if you're thinking about it from an American perspective. And there are real issues of trust that are worthy of consideration. Something like 5G is fundamental to the infrastructure of every country. So there's reasons to have policies that address that. But I think it's a mistake to think that if you somehow get lower tariffs for some other product, suddenly you're not going to think about the trust issues. You didn't think about them because you were worried about the price of soybeans. You thought about them because you were thinking about the future of your information infrastructure.
We've got about a minute left for each of you, and you've written a book, Tools and Weapons, also been talking about a digital Geneva Convention for Technology. Just paint a picture in 1 minute for what you would like to see in the next few years to restore trust in technology.
Well, I'd really like to see tech companies continue to step up. I think we need to do more. We need to do more separately. We need to do more together. And we need to put guardrails on our products so that they won't be used in ways that we come to regret. I think we need governments to move faster. We need governments to do more. I think we in the tech sector have a responsibility to share the kind of information and develop the ideas that can help make that possible.
And Rory, you've got the platform of an election year in 2020 when voters will be tuned into the messages. How do you think you can push forward this conversation and restore trust in tech over the next year?
I think we should start with the premise that the technology revolution is akin to the industrial revolution, and how governments respond to it is arguably the central challenge of our time. We need thoughtful regulation on an Internet Bill of Rights on privacy. We need thoughtful regulations on antitrust, and we need to collaborate with technology companies to bring jobs and opportunities to people and communities left out. And I know Brad has been doing some of that work in Microsoft, and I would urge more technology companies to really look at the ripples of hope they can create by having those kind of successes in communities that haven't had those opportunities.
The screen is flashing at us, but I've got time for one more. You're both on the same aisle, effectively. Brad, I think you made a big donation to Nancy Pelosi in the last 24 hours or so. Does it matter who's in the White House in terms of how technology will be tackled from a regulation point of view?
It always matters who is in the White House. Doesn't matter what the issue is. It matters who's in the White House.
Of course,
yes.
Not to be partisan, but this president has discontinued the Medal for National Science. I mean, we need a president who's going to believe in science and technology and understand what it's going to take to have American leadership in the 21st century.
Well, and I would just say, look, as a company, our philosophy is we will always partner with any government where we can. We will always stand apart where we believe we should. Yes, I wrote a check for Nancy Pelosi, but we sued the Obama administration 4 times over surveillance and privacy issues. We've sued this administration twice, once over immigration, once around privacy. Right. I think as the public, we need to have a broad conversation. Tech companies should be held accountable. Governments should as well.
Brad, we're out of time. Thank you so much for the conversation.